And welcome. We are starting part 2, The Astronomer. And today we're going to go from page 45 until page 56. And I'm going to apologize in advance. The scanning has cut off the top line of text on every page, unfortunately. So if there's anything significant, I'll fill you in. Otherwise, you just keep annotating on your own books at home. So yes, we begin, and this section includes Daniel Rook's arrival in Australia, and some things I noted here on the first page, page 45. So Rook is on board the ship, the Sirius, and I noticed a change in his attitude here. Begin as you mean to go on, Rook's father tells him. So he makes sure that he is conspicuously an astronomer and he did not have to pretend. And I wondered if there was a sense of him embracing his identity here, as opposed to earlier. So it contrasts with earlier on when he learnt to hide, having special skills and abilities, and actually pretending not to be so clever, for example. And there's a number of descriptions of the navigation process, and we are introduced to a few of the other characters, Captain Barton, Lieutenant Gardner, and both Barton and Gardner are described as kind. And page 46, we have a description of the Lieutenant Gardner, particularly as a burly, sunburnt soldier and big in every sense. Everything about him on a generous scale. And there's a description of their first meeting where Lieutenant Gardner says, "Welcome, Rook. 3 of us on the job. The ocean may as well be the King's highway." There's a sense of welcoming friendship, kindness, and generosity. And that's certainly something that we learn about Lieutenant Gardner throughout. They're both Navy officers, as opposed to Daniel Rook, who is a Marines officer. So another example of a contrast in status that is a motif that occurs throughout the novel. So there's a description of how they navigate. They require the sun, some poetic descriptions there. And a note that Silk is, so Rook is on the flagship, the navigating ship, and Silk was on the final ship, the rear of the 11 ships on board the ship called the Charlotte. And so they only get to meet when they pull into a port. Silk makes a start on his narrative, and there's a poetic, flowery description that he reads to Rook. And I made some notes about the conversation afterwards. So after he reads this poetic description of, I think it's of the soldiers going for a walk, Rook says, very clever, very deft of phrasing, but have you really walked there every evening? Showing that Rook is valuing truth and logic as important. Silk's reply, "Oh, Rook, the man of science, let's just call it poetic license, my friend." So for him, art or the poetic nature of not the exact truth, but having something that sounds beautiful is more important. And I noticed the juxtaposition of these two ideas, maths, science, logic, and art, and the poetic nature of the existence are juxtaposed, as well as Silk and Rook being juxtaposed. And that's another motif that's used throughout the whole novel, or another pattern that's used of the juxtaposition of the two opposing characters. And that's continued at the bottom of page 47 there too. And then we meet the Commodore, James Gilbert, and later he becomes Governor Gilbert, but while he's on the ship, he's Commodore Gilbert, who is described as somewhat cautious, with a sour look. That's what's missing there, a sour look on his face. I've kind of noted that perhaps he's grumpy. He doesn't often smile, and if he does, it's the most formal of smiles. And there's a description of Governor Gilbert here, who always has pain in his side, and that perhaps is the reason for his poor temperament. It may be the kidneys, maybe the gallbladder, we don't really know. But Surgeon Waymark, who's the doctor of the ship, describes that he's tried lots of potions on the Commodore, bled him, cupped him, and palpated his side for an hour each morning to try and get rid of the pain, and none of it has any effect. So he's in constant pain. And when the Commodore comes up on deck, everybody the joy disappears. Everybody goes quiet, becomes severe, and they say it's difficult to warm to him as he shares none of his thoughts with other men. And each day at noon, the Captain Barton, Rook, and the Commodore, the three of them, go and do this process. And here becomes a 2-page description of winding the Greenwich Mean Time watch or timekeeper. So they go to the belly of the ship, and the room is guarded by a sentinel, and it sort of implies something must be precious or important. And then there's a description on page 49 of the actual timekeeper itself. And it's in between 2 red cushions. It's on a table that's screwed to the floor, in a box screwed to the table. So it's something that's really precious. And it's the size of a soup plate, so it's quite large. And every day at noon, they wind the clock. And so a busy, secretive mechanism that gets wound up. And after they wind it, there's this regulation that says all 3 of them, one at a time, have to say the timekeeper has been wound. And then only after all 3 of them have said the timekeeper has been wound, the timekeeper has been wound, then are they allowed to leave, and the sentinel comes back. So it's quite a rigmarole, which is what's missing, that word here. And Silk would have totally entertained everyone in the mess with it. But something of note here is the ritual of the winding of the timekeeper, the clock. It puts Rook, who was a low officer in the Marines, a man of no importance, and the Commodore, who's the head of the whole Navy, places them at equal status. And I do think that status is a theme that's recurring. And so this moment perhaps is suggesting Kate Grenville's views and values about the, the equality of all men, despite the machine or the mechanism of the clock, which perhaps could potentially represent the British imperial, mighty imperial machine, perhaps. And the watch's importance is emphasized by the fact that it's helping them to navigate. You can Google how that happens. We had somebody do it today. It's fascinating. To do with longitude and latitude. Anyway, here we go. So page 51. And There's a description of the physical environment and this idea of place, the setting of the New South Wales coastline, and the rawness of that natural environment is another theme or another motif. The descriptions of that, and so wherever you see that, make sure you make a note of it, because you may be asked a question on how the sense of place contributes to the text and the themes of the text. So there's a description of the, I guess, the maelstrom of white water, so the storm of water juxtaposed with these quiet waters beyond the cliff. So there's appearance of wildness in juxtaposition with the wild water, perhaps representing the precariousness of the situation that they are actually in. And so some natives are seen shaking their spears and calling wara wara, which Rook suspects may be something like go to the devil. And now they arrive, and there's a moment of arrival. The sailors at the bottom of 51, they get ready to go ashore, and there's the armed privates, the sea soldiers, and then the Navy officers, and they all kind of step down onto this foreign soil, which might as well be Saturn, could be a one-word quote you use, for all that anyone knows of it. And some Surgeon Waymark steps down, and 5 native men step out of the bushes. Now they have shields and spears, which is contrasted with, or again, this whole theme of this section is juxtaposition. So that is juxtaposed with the muskets of the Marines who are on the ship. And at the the top of 53. And what's missing here is actually important at the top of 53. So there's a line saying, the trinkets, Sergeant, where are the trinkets? And a trinket has this connotation of a small thing. This is another one you could use as a single word quote. So the fact that they're presenting trinkets represents their relative lack of importance in the eyes of the British. A trinket, the connotation of the trinket is a small, worthless thing or unimportant thing. And there's a string of beads and there's a looking glass that's used. So it catches the sun. It's a bit of a shiny thing, but nothing of value that you would present to somebody who you actually wanted to honour, for example. And there's a mocking tone, or rather a tone of superiority, definitely in the way that they speak to the Indigenous people here that you can see. So that is evident, and the way that they describe or call the natives Mr. Darky here. And they later on, where is it? No. All right. We'll forget about it. Oh, yeah. Describe it as a greyhound. Then Rook kind of hands a looking glass out, and one of the Indigenous men takes that and steps back, and they look at it, but then they throw it on the ground. They're all waiting. And Waymark, actually, this is a key moment, put a big star next to this one. he takes one of the natives' shields and he says just to borrow it, and then he puts it in the sand. He cocks his pistol, loads his pistol, cocks the hammer, and he fires at it, and the shield splits in two. There's a smell of gunpowder, and the ball goes straight through the shield and leaves a ragged hole, and splits it from top to bottom. It falls into two pieces, and then the native man holds it up against his belly and like, would this do this to me? And here, yes, oh my very word, my black friend, he cries, split you from skull to asshole, by God. Feel the derogatory, pejorative way that this is, he's speaking. And then they all laugh at this joke, and by kind of a contagion, Rook laughs too. So the implication, contagion being like he catches the laughter, not necessarily wanting to laugh, but peer pressure kind of laugh, and it's something that you may want to refer to later on. They are not entertained, however. They frown and they speak to each other urgently. The Commodore isn't particularly happy, but now the surgeon starts to whistle, and finishes off this section with the natives having stony faces, really unappreciative, and they take the two pieces of the shield and disappear into the woods. And hopefully you have noticed the symbolism of the broken shield, which represents the broken relationship from the beginning. Or you could also go wider to say the destruction of the shield could represent the destruction of Indigenous culture in a larger way by the arrival of the British forces. So that's the end of this section. Hopefully you've got some good notes. Make sure you've got your summaries and your themes and your juxtapositions and your character notes and everything working as we are working through this text. Okay, thanks all.